Welcome to the New Books Network.
Welcome to New Books in European Politics. I'm Tim Jones, and my guest today is Isaac Stanley-Becker, author of Europe Without Borders: A History, published today by Princeton University Press. 40 years ago, a winemaking village at the tripoint border of Luxembourg, France and Germany made European history. In Schengen, in 1985, diplomats from West Germany, France, Belgium, the Netherlands and Luxembourg signed a treaty to scale back their mutual border checks. The event at Schengen went unnoticed by much of the European press, writes Isaac Stanley-Becker. Yet, as one of its negotiators realized later, the Schengen Agreement, quote, changed everything, accelerating the development of the European single market and currency area by freeing up the movement of people. Today, however, Schengen is under threat, as its now 29 members struggle to balance free movement, cross-border policing, immigration control and political consent. In September, the German government, rattled by surging support for the nativist AfD party, reinstated border controls with its 4 Schengen founders, prompting threats of retaliation from other members. Isaac Stanley-Becker is an investigative reporter at The Washington Post, part of the team that won a Pulitzer Prize in 2024. A graduate of Yale, where he developed his love of journalism, he went on to complete a PhD in history at Oxford in 2019. This is his first book. How did a Washington Post reporter come to write The Origins of European Free Movement?
Well, I began work on the project just in the aftermath of Brexit, or shortly after Brexit, while I was doing a lot of reporting for the Washington Post on some of these hard-fought elections on the continent, the Netherlands, France, Germany. In all of these contests, migration and security were really at the center of the discussion. So that's when I started thinking about the origins of these questions and the origins of Schengen. And I realized there hadn't been history of this consequential agreement written, and in large part because there had been a 30-year embargo on these diplomatic records. So 1985 is when the initial agreement was signed. Takes us right up until 2015. A lot of these materials had never been looked at, and that for a journalist is gold. It's like a historical scoop. That's kind of how I viewed it.
So what was the order of the work? Because obviously you were studying a lot of this when you were at Oxford. Did you foresee the opening of the archives before you started the work, or was it something that came to you after the archives had opened?
I only realized that there was this embargo once I started looking for records and getting in touch with archivists. And in certain cases, because my research goes, the archival material, I would say, goes from the heart of it from 1984 until about 1995, though parts of the book go back, much, much further into the past. And then the epilogue and other parts go up really until the present. But I would say that the heart of the narrative is 1984 until 1995, which meant that there was actually some of this that fell just after the embargo, or again, figuring 30 years. So I had the help of some really good archivists who were able to locate the material that got to the heart of the agreement. And some of that came just after, or just within the 30 years. And they were able to say, well, within a couple months, this will be open. So we're happy to have you look at this. So no, I didn't realize that there was this restriction that was about to lift, or was just lifting, until I started to think, Schengen, that's an interesting system that hasn't really gotten a thorough historical treatment. And then I realized the reason was because all this material was being kept under lock and key.
Well, you went further than that too, right? Because I think you spoke to Robert Goebbels, you certainly spoke to Françoise Gravier. Is that a typical way for someone doing this kind of work to operate, or is that your journalistic chops kicking in?
Well, I think oral history is a method that a number of historians use to supplement other kinds of historical research. It came certainly very naturally to me because my work is interviewing people and contacting people, explaining who I am and what I'm after, and why their perspective or viewpoint is of relevance to the project I'm working on. It was fascinating to have their recollections about this, and also to be able to have them explain certain diplomatic formulations or laconic formulations that really did need more exposition.
Now, as you said, and you also write it in the book, that Schengen is, quote, one of the great unstudied projects in post-war European history. And yet, as you pointed out, free movement has been an extraordinary achievement, but also incredibly controversial in Europe. Why do you think it has been so understudied?
I think there's been a lot of ink spilled on it. I think there's been a lot of polemics, and I think it's the focus on Schengen, the study of Schengen, has really not been on its origins, but on the operation of the treaty. and it's been political scientists, geographers, criminologists, others. And I think in large part that is because of this 30-year embargo. The historical record illuminating the origins of this agreement just was not available until very recently, and that's what I was able to dive into. I think there are some other factors, including the fact that Schengen has just become so interwoven into the fabric of European law and the fabric of European life that you really have to go back and muck around in these records to understand how it came to be. Since Schengen was negotiated on the intergovernmental level outside the formal processes of the European community and then the European Union, but since the Treaty of Amsterdam in 1997, which went into effect in 1999, it has been part of EU law. So I think there had just become an assumption that free movement and Schengen are just part of life in the EU and almost taken for granted. And part of what the book shows is that that's not the case. This was this really contested process of coming up with this outside the formal arena of European community institutions.
Going back in time, well before Schengen, you identify these two strands coming out of the Second World War as economism and humanism, the first personified by Paul-Henri Spaak and the second by Altiero Spinelli, the first driving the initial 40 years of integration and the second driving Schengen and all that came with it. For those of us who've worked on the economic side of the European Union, I think we tend to ignore or play down the opposite side. But the humanist side is clearly very important from the history you've written.
I think they were both extremely important, and there was a dialogue between them, an uneasy dialogue for the most part. I wouldn't necessarily say that one gave way to the other, that there was a period of time in which one was operative and then the other was operative. I think that both visions animated integration, and a certain one took precedence or priority at certain points. As a bit of background, Paul-Henri Spaak was a Belgian diplomat who had helped form the Benelux Customs Union, which is an important Schengen forerunner late during the Second World War. This is a system uniting Belgium, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands. He then served as the first president of the European Coal and Steel Community, and he's the author of this very influential 1956 report that actually came to be known as the Spaak Report, proposing a common market and other forms of multinational cooperation that laid the groundwork for the Treaty of Rome. So that's Spaak. And then you have Altiero Spinelli, who was an Italian dissident, Gramsci disciple, who was imprisoned for opposing Italy's fascist government and confined on the island of Ventotene during the war. He's perhaps best known for authoring a manifesto arguing for a federal Europe that came to be known as the Ventotene Manifesto, named for this island where he was detained. And what he wanted was a cosmopolitan federation founded on social democratic principles. And this is really a fascinating history in its own right, how this document gets smuggled off this island. It's scribbled on cigarette papers and brought to Rome, where it circulates within the Italian resistance and ultimately becomes the program for the movement for European federalism. So again, there is a dialogue between these two visions, and what I think you're right in boiling down as a vision of market freedom and market union, and political or more civic vision, civic union, as models of pan-Europeanism. And Spaak's vision certainly won out in the formation of the Treaty of Rome, the 1957 treaty that really gives birth to the European community that's centrally preoccupied with joining markets, market freedom, and the market as a kind of substratum of European integration. But I think both legacies were imprinted in this post-war vision of free movement, and I think both have echoes in Schengen, and that's what I tease out.
Did those two strands ally themselves with left and right? I mean, as you point out, Spinelli was a Euro-communist, and Spaak operated from a blueprint really put together by Hayek at the end of the war, and that led to the coal and steel community, to the economic community. Were there figures on the right or the centre that were in the Spinelli camp, or did it tend to break down according to left and right strains?
There certainly was a vision of market freedom that gained ascendance and that was consistent with Spaak's vision. And I think that there was concern about faith in the market alone as a kind of self-actualizing process or entity that was voiced by Spinelli, who wrote this letter to Spaak when his vision was kind of gaining a prominence or priority in the planning, who said, the market is not a natural institution. It has to be supported by these other forces, civic, political, social forces. That was certainly not a view that was held by the likes of Hayek, who thought that the establishment of economic union, the abolition of these economic barriers would simply unleash market forces and, do away with these impediments to the movement of not just people, but very importantly, goods, capital, and services. So I think there is certainly an economic liberalism and neoliberal vision that does compete with a vision of social solidarity, of the civic good, of the social good as being needing to be constitutive of union. But I don't know that I would necessarily put it on a left-right axis, because Spock, I think, would not be kind of right-wing a figure, but more so in a kind of free market orthodoxy versus a concern and preoccupation with other kinds of values.
Coming to Schengen 40 years ago, when I think of the big years of European integration, the pivotal years, I might think of 1992 or 99 or 1957, but I've never thought of 1985 as a pivotal year before until I read your book. And that's not just because of this agreement, but the parallel tracks you identified from the Fontainebleau Summit, the Tindemans and Adonino committees, and a court case I'd never heard of until I read your book, which is Gravier and Liège.
It's true. I think I would propose 1984, 1985, 1986 as really key years leading up to the Single European Act, which advances the single market and sets this deadline for the completion of the single market. 1984, you have Fontainebleau, which is this important summit in which François Mitterrand, the president of France, proclaims this vision of Citizens Europe. This becomes an important starting point for Schengen. And 1985, as you mentioned, this fascinating court case of a French woman, a cartoon artist, Françoise Clavier, who sues to have essentially equal treatment when she's studying cartoon art in Belgium, arguing that she has the right to travel to Belgium to pursue her education there across borders. And again, that becomes an important kind of spur for a broader grant and guarantee of free movement. And then, of course, the initial Schengen Agreement signed in 1985. All the while, of course, and especially in France, you have the rising electoral threat from the National Front, the nativist far-right party. So a lot of forces are coming together, I think it's true, in the middle of the 1980s to advance a certain vision of integration, to ensure that the movement toward the single market is on the right track, and also to contend with certain political forces that we're certainly still living with today.
Well, funnily enough, it's a perfect example of how people don't necessarily know they're living through history. When you interviewed Françoise Gravier, she admitted, I didn't follow Schengen closely, not at all. I certainly didn't either between 1985 and 1995.
I was so thrilled to find Madame Gravier and to be able to speak with her, because she was still working as an artist, still drawing wonderful comic strips and other types of drawings, because I had read these court cases, briefs from lawyers, and had come to see her as so pivotal to this history I was writing about. And then to get her on the phone and to discuss that with her. She was a young student at this time in the early and in the mid 80s. And as I mentioned, she brought this court case trying to be able to study free of what she and her lawyers argued was a discriminatory fee based on being a French citizen and not a Belgian citizen. The reason why this is so important is because she wins that case, but it's on a very kind of strictly economic vision of free movement that she's pursuing in education. That's vocational training. She has a right to be doing that as an economic actor in the European community. And so it's a commercial paradigm of free movement. And that's what Schengen has to transcend. And Schengen comes up with a broader vision of free movement that says that people and not just commercial and economic actors have a right to move across borders and be free from national discrimination in that way. So she's foundational to this history, but you're right that she was not terribly conscious of this treaty making at the time. And I think that is so interesting, and it speaks to the way this unfolded at remove from kind of democratic deliberation, popular will. It also, I think, speaks to the interesting piecemeal nature of the guarantee of free movement. So you have free movement among the Benelux countries, Belgium, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands. Prior to this, starting in 1984, you have a bilateral agreement between France and Germany that comes with a guarantee of free movement. And then this merges in 1985, and you start to dismantle border controls first among these 5 states. So it happens slowly, and I think people living through this at the time could be forgiven for not realizing that there was this, grand treaty called Schengen, but just thinking, okay, it's becoming easier to drive across this border, and that makes my everyday life easier.
Do you think that's why it was downplayed so much? I mean, as you point out, the original agreement was signed on a riverboat off Schengen by essentially a bunch of state secretaries. There was not very senior involvement in these talks. And do you think that was largely because the original idea was just to speed up the traffic at borders? They would address the more detailed operational side later.
I think that's right. And I think in some ways, Schengen is a story of unintended consequences, or of consequences not fully grasped by its makers at the time, both good and bad, or vexed, complicated consequences. The primary French treaty maker, Catherine Lalumière, told me when we spoke about this, we were doing our job as junior ministers. At the time, we didn't see this as this grand revolution in how Europe operated. This was a priority of the president, of Mitterrand. It was a priority in terms of his relationship with Kohl, Helmut Kohl, the West German chancellor. And we were trying to make life easier for people and advance progress toward the single market. So there really wasn't a huge amount of fanfare, and the deliberations themselves were secret. They were not open to the public. And this, of course, becomes terribly controversial later during the ratification process. But it's fascinating the way this happens in a very humdrum, diplomatic way, and then it becomes explosive within a number of years, and really is at the center of political storm in Europe.
And yet, when you compare it to many other negotiations at the European level, it's done incredibly efficiently and quickly. Do you think this is largely down to Kohl and Mitterrand personally, as you mentioned, that there was personal drive, impetus between them? How much of it was that? How much of it was the fact that the negotiations were intergovernmental? They didn't involve federal agencies or arbitrators, and it only involved a handful of states. Do you think this was critical to getting it done quickly?
I think it was. And the original 1985 agreement is negotiated and signed extremely quickly in a matter of months. But it's really a charter of intent. It's very, very brief. It essentially says there's guarantee of free movement. There'll be an elimination of border controls or a relaxation of border controls. It sets out, certain principles for people, goods, services, and then essentially just previews some of the security mechanisms, some of the compensatory security mechanisms that will, compensate for the relaxation of border controls. And it is this process, driven by this partnership primarily between France and West Germany, between Kohl and Mitterrand, along with the Benelux states, and by these junior ministers who were acting on the prerogative of these heads of states. But then, as we see, the implementing invention takes many, many years to negotiate and becomes extremely controversial, largely centered on these issues of security, policing, surveillance, and everything that must be done to compensate for free movement. So in a couple of months, you come up with a charter of intent that's signed in 1985, but then it takes 5 years to come up with what this actually looks like and all that needs to be done to make this a reality, and very importantly, to gain approval from the national parliaments in the participating states, because it requires ratification.
Yes, you write, quote, the post-1990 ratification process brought Schengen out from the shadows, and approving the convention exposed tensions that marked the treaty's principal objectives, the pairing of freedom and security, and the joining of humanist and market justifications for European unification. Now, it was controversial for that period, but your focus is very much on French ratification. Was that largely because that's where your interest was, or was it where it really was the most problematic ratification?
France went first, 1991, and it really becomes an important test case. France gives Schengen its first democratic endorsement, but it also is first to play host to a really vexed debate over what Schengen means for France, what it means for Europe, what it means for the world. So that's why I gave prior place to that ratification debate, though Germany is last, funnily enough. The two driving states are first and last, and both play host to really vexed, complex debates about the meaning of Schengen. There are other important reasons why France has kind of a leading role in the book. Certainly, as I mentioned, the partnership between Mitterrand and Kohl drove the treaty making, their initiative. France in particular played a really decisive role, what was called a locomotive effect in one of the diplomatic documents I found. France was the first country to chair the central negotiating group after the approval of the 1985 accord. So France essentially helped set the terms for the subsequent negotiations. Then, especially critical was France's role in taking on a dual presidency in 1989, which is an important year, as your listeners know, for a number of reasons. So it takes on this dual presidency in 1989, both of the central negotiating group, the Schengen central negotiating group, in the early part of the year, and then in the Council of Ministers, which is an important deliberative body in the latter half of the year. So France's position is really important throughout these years of treaty making, and the ratification debates were fascinating. It was a really rancorous process and rancorous debate, and it was about the present-day consequences of Schengen, about what would happen to immigration and French borders and borders of these other states. But there were also history lessons here. The French debate goes back to what was the meaning of French republicanism, the formation of French independence, questions about the papacy and ancient history of Europe, and de Gaulle and the Second World War. In Germany, you have anguished discussions about legacy of Nazism and what that means about Germany's obligations to asylum seekers and other people. So it dredges up all these really foundational questions for these individual nations and also for Europe collectively.
Yeah, the French debates, or the initial French debate, was really fascinating because it would have fallen around the same time as the referendum on the Maastricht Treaty in 1992. And I remember the splits then that included senior members of the Socialist Party, but also senior figures from the Gaullist movement. But the person who completely passed me by, and you talk about him at length in your book, is Michel Debré and his influence and how he was essentially, or saw himself as the guardian of the founding of the Fifth Republic, and saw this progression in Europe as something was undermining that.
He didn't just see himself as the founder of the Fifth Republic. He had drafted the 1958 French Constitution, so he had a right to claim that legacy or that inheritance. And he raises, amidst this kind of confusion about what Schengen meant in the 1980s as it's first being negotiated, there isn't a lot of understanding of it. He's one of the early people who raises some concern about the relaxation of borders and what this will mean. He has a whole bibliography of books that raise concerns about European integration and argues that in the form it's taking, at least, this is really an amputation for France to give up this kind of sovereignty to a multinational system, to Brussels, to take these decisions collectively. And by the time that Schengen comes before the French Parliament for ratification, he's no longer serving. He's held various titles throughout this time, defense minister, others. He's in Parliament no longer by 1991. By the time there's this ratification debate, but interestingly, he has sons who had joined the National Assembly 2 years before Michel Debré resigned from it. And after the ratification gains approval and the opposition to it fails, there's a judicial complaint, a legal complaint that's brought before the judiciary in June of 1991. And both of Debré's sons signed their names to this complaint. So the opposition to Schengen, I think, is quite literally Debré's progeny, both in terms of his writing, his commentary against certain forms of European integration, and then also in the opposition that counts among its members, two of his sons.
The internal debates in Germany and the Netherlands that you identify are very interesting as well, because they take the opposite tack. They take liberal direction regarding the idea that if you have first state asylum approvals in other states, these country states were foregoing their right to accept or reject asylum. Very interesting, particularly in light of the kind of debates we have today.
This is something that is seized on or flagged or raised by a number of judicial bodies in the signatory states, concerns with the provisions on asylum, and specifically this provision that the country for adjudicating given asylum claim is the country where that asylum seeker first arrived. And as you say, this is at the heart of the asylum mess in Europe in the present day. It's worth just backing up briefly, because asylum, it becomes such a critical issue during the final treaty making, during the ratification, and then implementation. And this has a lot of relevance for today in terms of responsibility for certain asylum claims or different asylum claims. So it's fairly well known at this point that one of the rules that's deranging current European asylum policy is this rule of first entry. The country that's responsible is the country where that asylum seeker first enters. Obviously, this burdens Italy and Greece more than it burdens Finland. This comes from the Dublin regulation, which was approved in 1990, but it actually appeared earlier in the Schengen treaty making, and Dublin is essentially modeled on this from Schengen. So there was immense debate about this at the time, and considerations in the ratification debates about whether it impinged on Germany's or France's or other countries' responsibility to asylum seekers. If they were able to just say, well, it's Italy's burden, was that a violation of their constitutional principles along with international legal principles about the responsibility to take in and care for and adjudicate asylum claims? So there are constitutional changes in certain states that result from this. And interestingly, all of this is now in flux. The European Union has just recently agreed to this new set of rules to handle irregular arrivals and asylum seekers. That's expected to take quite a while to actually go into effect, possibly until the end of 2025 or even longer. But it does recognize that this first entry rule is not workable, and it assigns more specific shares of asylum seekers to certain states based on things like the size of the country's GDP, its population, the number of irregular crossings, and so on. So I think it's a lesson of how a lot of this current debate was foreseen and warned of as part of the Schengen process by judicial bodies in some of these states, Belgium, elsewhere, both France and Germany, but then also in the treaty-making process itself.
You've touched on this during this conversation, but a central theme of your book is Schengen's two sides. So the creation of a free space meant both a tightening of external border controls and cooperative surveillance to manage illegal immigration, cross-border crime and terrorism. And I wanted to pick out a quote from the book where you say, Schengen was not the site of an armed battle. No sovereign had gained or lost an empire there. But within its borders, the nature of sovereignty would change as supranational measures of security compensated for the dismantling of internal frontiers.
I'm so glad you mentioned that particular point, and it's such a good transition from our discussion about the ratification debates, because that comes from a point that is raised in the ratification debates where a lawmaker says, Schengen doesn't deserve the lore that surrounds it. It's not Rome. It's not some of these other places that have given their name to huge armed battles, the fall of empires, other locations in Europe. It's just a agreement to allow for free movement. And I think it's a fascinating point, but something really foundational does happen here, and it does have to do with questions of sovereignty and the relationship between freedom and security, because Schengen rests on this principle that you can have free movement and you can have security. And the reason for that is that it takes controls at once operated physical points, physical landmarks, border checkpoints, and it puts them into the digital realm. And that's why I devote so much of the book to the development of this digital security and digital surveillance mechanisms, because even though this would be considered crude by today's standards, it's a starting point and a kind of warning shot of some of the modes and methods of data collection, surveillance, transnational data collection, and digital security that have become so pervasive, so widely used today. So that's what the treaty makers think is going to enable freedom to go hand in hand with security, and this transformation of the way that policing power and border controls and sovereignty works. I mentioned it earlier in our discussion that there haven't really been histories of Schengen written, but some of the really incisive pieces of writing that have been done have actually been by some of the treaty makers. So I focus on this one essay that was written by a police commissioner in France who wrote about freedom and security being, as he put it, an inseparable pair. And that's a foundational premise of Schengen, but I think it's one that we're still finding is being tested and can't be counted on as an absolute.
You end the book with a retrospective on the sans-papier movement and how this became, as you put it, a laboratory of rival ideas about the free movement of people. I didn't quite understand this because it seems clear-cut to me. Once you leave aside the kind of remarks made by Majigan Cissé referring to savage liberalism, there's essentially only one trade-off for a continent that needs more working people. You need more generous legal immigration and residency, but you can't, maybe this is a question. Do you think her argument that essentially someone who comes into France on a 90-day tourist visa and stays for 7 years, is that something that would be politically sustainable?
Schengen does and doesn't speak to this question, and that elision is important because it enables certain things, largely movement, cross-border travel without hindrance, without addressing other questions. And residence is a key issue, and I think that's part of what you're getting at. But Schengen doesn't speak to residence. It speaks to border checks and movement across borders. It doesn't regulate who can live where. But at the same time, obviously, it has implications for residents. This goes back to 1984 when the ad hoc committee arising from this Proclamation of Citizens Europe by Mitterrand says, wow, it seems as though free movement implies a right of residence, but that would go far beyond the Rome Treaty. And what most concerned the committee were the economic costs of a non-economic guarantee of free movement. So they spoke of an unreasonable burden on the public purse in the host country. So what ends up happening is that they say this is a political decision that needs to be addressed, and it's never settled. It's still a determination made by individual member states. So there are certain rules pertaining to, a worker who comes in with on a certain visa or grant, and that would still depend in large part on certain national rules, of course, governed by EU regulations. But what Schengen provides is cross-border travel for citizens of European Union member states. Of course, once border checks come down, it's not necessarily possible to determine who is and who isn't a European Union citizen, as one of the French treaty makers wrote in one of the records, neither European citizens nor non-citizens has their nationality written on their face. So these rules in practice are not always possible to police as the treaty makers would have envisioned or would have hoped. The question of workers and residents is in many ways one that Schengen doesn't address or doesn't provide for. And one could see that in certain ways as a limitation of the treaty.
Yeah, and the demographics are different 40 years on. 10% of the EU population is now ethnic minority. Germany's Syrian origin citizenship alone has grown by 150,000 in the last decade. And as we saw in the US during the election in November 2024, quite a lot of these people who are of ethnic minority or are newcomers to the US or to the European Union are potentially the most protective of the external border.
I think you're right to point out this parallel, and it certainly was a bold-faced result from the recent American election. I can't speak necessarily to perceptions of external security by, say, naturalized European citizens or others. I imagine that views may vary just as they do among immigrants in the U.S. and elsewhere. I will say there's interesting opinion research that suggests that free movement remains a really prized aspect of European integration, even amidst this backlash to immigration, globalization, and other cornerstones of European integration. There's certainly this trade-off that underlies free movement, that you relax internal controls, you have to heighten external controls. And there's been various methods and efforts of doing this, whether it's, hardened exteriors, fencing, detention in, off the coast of Italy, engagement with Northern European countries to try to stop the flow of this immigration. And again, I just think the particulars matter in terms of who might favor what sort of controls to accomplish what. The chapter in the Sans-Papiers, this uprising in France that spreads across Europe, there is an important legacy of colonialism here. And in the thinking of the Sans-Papiers, there is this profound sense that France and other countries owe a debt to the former colonial subjects. And I think that certainly informs the perceptions of what kind of border controls are appropriate or ethical or comply with France's and other countries' stated Republican values and commitments to human rights and individual dignity going back to the 18th century.
Schengen has been tested in ways that the original drafters couldn't possibly have imagined. We've had a global pandemic, a war, and it does feel vulnerable every time there's an election in France, Germany, or Italy. You say in the book, at the very end, you say you fear, quote, Schengen's death by 1,000 cuts. What did you mean exactly?
I think we're witnessing its death by 1,000 cuts, and I can't predict the future as a historian or as a journalist, but I think the signs are mounting that these threats, whether it's the pandemic, a record number of asylum seekers in 2015 and the aftershocks of that, war in the Middle East, war in Ukraine, this is testing this vision in an unprecedented way. And we're seeing the restoration of checks on a systematic level. Of course, this was built into the treaty, the possibility of derogating from its terms. And there are certain principles that come along with this. It has to be for reasons of public policy or national security. It's supposed to be limited, and the European Court of Justice has weighed in on this and said that the way that certain countries are reintroducing checks doesn't comply with the law, but the European Court of Justice has limited enforcement powers. So I think yes, the threat to free movement appears especially acute right now, and Germany's move just this past September to reintroduce controls of all of its land borders. We saw the way in which this was denounced by other European leaders. Donald Tusk, was unacceptable, who called it the suspension of Schengen on a large scale. So I think that these elections will have major consequences. We'll have to see what happens with this new asylum sharing system and whether this allays some of the concern, and also what European populations expect or demand in terms of once they're no longer able to move as freely, whether that becomes unacceptable to them on a kind of everyday level.
To close, because this is a New Books Network podcast, I've asked my guests to recommend 2 books. The first is broadly from the same field, and the second is a personal choice. So, Isaac, what have you chosen?
So I think that anyone who's interested in issues of sovereignty, individual dignity, nationalism, and internationalism should read East-West Street by Philippe Sands, which traces the history behind concepts of genocide and crimes against humanity, and is at its core about how individuals vindicate their rights, including across borders. It's also just a beautifully written family history as well. The other book I'd recommend is not completely unrelated. I actually just read The Man Who Saw Everything by Deborah Levy and found it a strange and frankly somewhat overwhelming book about European totalitarianism, love, masculinity, memory, and wrongdoing. So it's a slim book, a slim novel, and I think it's a terrific read.
Today I've been talking to Isaac Stanley-Becker, author of Europe Without Borders, published today by Princeton University Press. Isaac, thanks again for coming on.
Thank you.